Sarah Martinez had always been smaller than her peers, standing barely 5 feet 2 inches tall and weighing only 115 pounds. When she walked through the gates of Fort Benning for basic training, the other recruits couldn't help but stare. Some snickered behind her back, while others openly questioned whether she had what it took to make it through the grueling weeks ahead. The drill sergeants were equally skeptical. Sergeant Johnson, a towering man with arms like tree trunks, looked down at Sarah during the first formation and shook his head. He had seen plenty of recruits come and go, and in his experience, the small ones usually washed out within the first 2 weeks. Sarah could feel his doubt radiating toward her like heat from a furnace. During the initial physical fitness test, Sarah struggled with the push-ups. While the male recruits pumped out 30 or 40 with ease, she managed only 12 before her arms gave out. The pull-up bar might as well have been mounted on the moon for all the good it did her. She couldn't complete a single one. The running portion went better, but she still finished in the bottom quarter of the group. That evening in the barracks, the whispers started in earnest. A linebacker-sized recruit from Texas made no effort to keep his voice down when he told his bunkmate that having Sarah in their unit was like carrying dead weight. He predicted she would quit before the week was out, and several other recruits nodded in agreement. Jennifer, another female recruit who stood 6 inches taller and outweighed Sarah by 40 pounds, tried to be encouraging but couldn't hide her own doubts. She suggested that maybe Sarah should consider a different branch of service, one that didn't require as much physical strength. The comment stung, even though it came from a place of concern rather than malice. The next few days brought a series of humiliating failures. During obstacle course training, Sarah couldn't scale the rope climb and had to be helped over the wall by 2 other recruits. In combat training, she could barely lift the heavy equipment packs that the others shouldered with ease. Each stumble and struggle was met with eye rolls, sighs, and barely concealed laughter from her fellow soldiers in training. Sergeant, who supervised the combat training exercises, pulled Sarah aside after a particularly difficult session. His weathered face showed a mixture of frustration and pity as he suggested she might want to consider requesting a transfer to a non-combat military occupation specialty. The conversation was meant to be helpful, but Sarah felt like she was being written off before she had truly been given a chance to prove herself. The breaking point came during a group exercise where recruits had to work in pairs to carry heavy sandbags across a muddy field. Sarah was paired with David, a soft-spoken recruit from California who had been one of the few not to openly mock her struggles. Despite his best efforts to compensate for her limited strength, they finished dead last, covered in mud and exhaustion. As they trudged back to the barracks, Sarah could hear behind them loudly wondering why the military was lowering its standards to accommodate people who clearly weren't cut out for the job. His words echoed the thoughts that Sarah had been fighting in her own mind for days. Maybe everyone was right. Maybe she didn't belong here. That night, lying on her narrow bunk while listening to the sounds of the barracks settling around her, Sarah seriously considered quitting. She had 3 more weeks of basic training ahead of her, and if the first week was any indication, each day would bring fresh humiliation and proof of her inadequacy. The easy thing to do would be to pack her bags in the morning and go home to her family's small apartment in Phoenix. But something deep inside her refused to accept defeat. Sarah had grown up watching her single mother work 3 jobs to keep food on the table and a roof over their heads. Giving up wasn't in her DNA, even when everything and everyone seemed to be telling her that she was fighting a losing battle. She made a silent promise to herself that night that she would find a way to prove the doubters wrong, no matter how impossible it seemed. Sarah's transformation didn't happen overnight, but it began with a conversation that changed everything. 2 days after her lowest point, she approached Sergeant First Class Williams, the only female drill instructor at the training facility. Williams had a reputation for being tough but fair, and Sarah desperately needed guidance from someone who might understand her struggle. Williams listened without interruption as Sarah poured out her frustrations about being constantly underestimated and mocked. When Sarah finished, the sergeant was quiet for a long moment before sharing her own story. 20 years earlier, Williams had faced similar challenges as one of the first women to serve in combat roles. She had learned that strength wasn't just about muscle mass. It was about determination, technique, and the ability to push through when others would give up. The next morning, Williams began working with Sarah during the pre-dawn hours before regular training started. They focused on technique rather than raw strength, learning how to use leverage and momentum to accomplish tasks that seemed impossible for someone Sarah's size. Williams taught her that the body could be trained to do extraordinary things, but the mind had to be conditioned first. Sarah threw herself into the extra training with desperate intensity. While her fellow recruits slept, she was doing push-ups in the bathroom. While they relaxed during breaks, she was practicing rope climbing techniques on a makeshift setup behind the barracks. Her hands became raw with blisters that hardened into calluses, and her muscles ached constantly, but she pushed through the pain. The other recruits began to notice the changes, though slowly at first. During the second week's physical fitness test, Sarah managed 22 push-ups instead of 12. She still couldn't do a pull-up, but she could hang from the bar for nearly a minute. Her running time improved by almost 2 minutes, and while she wasn't the fastest, she was no longer bringing up the rear. And his friends were less impressed than others might have hoped. They claimed that the drill sergeants were going easy on Sarah because she was small and female. They insisted that any improvements she showed were artificial, the result of special treatment rather than genuine capability. Their skepticism only fueled Sarah's determination to prove them completely wrong. Jennifer, who had initially doubted Sarah's potential, began to see something different in her bunkmate. Sarah's quiet intensity was infectious, and Jennifer found herself training harder as well. The two women began studying together, helping each other with military knowledge and procedures. Jennifer later admitted that Sarah's refusal to give up inspired her own commitment to excellence. By the third week, Sarah had become a different person entirely. Her her voice was stronger, and she moved with a confidence that hadn't been there before. During combat training exercises, she used speed and intelligence to overcome opponents who had significant size advantages. She learned to fight smart rather than fight hard, using her opponent's strength against them. The obstacle course that had once seemed impossible became manageable as Sarah mastered the techniques Williams had taught her. She still wasn't the fastest or strongest, but she completed every challenge without assistance. More importantly, she began helping other struggling recruits, sharing the knowledge she had gained through her own painful learning process. Sergeant Johnson, who had initially written Sarah off as hopeless, began to take notice. During a particularly challenging field exercise, he watched Sarah navigate a complex tactical problem with creativity and precision. She had found a solution that none of the larger, supposedly stronger recruits had considered. For the first time, he began to see her as a soldier rather than a liability. The real test came during the fourth week when the recruits faced their most challenging physical exercise yet. They had to complete a 12-mile march carrying full combat gear in sweltering heat. Several of the recruits who had mocked Sarah's early struggles ended up falling out of the march, overcome by heat and exhaustion. Sarah not only completed the march but finished in the middle of the pack, showing no signs of the weakness that everyone had once assumed was her defining characteristic. That evening, as the exhausted recruits recovered in the barracks, the atmosphere around Sarah had changed completely. The open mockery had stopped, replaced by a grudging respect from some and genuine admiration from others. Still grumbled about special treatment, but his complaints sounded hollow even to his own supporters. Sarah knew she had come far, but she also understood that the real test was still ahead. Basic training was almost over, and soon she would be facing the challenges of advanced military training and eventually real-world assignments. The foundation had been laid, but the structure of her military career was still being built, one small victory at a time. After graduating from basic training in the middle of her class, Sarah received orders to report to Fort Campbell for advanced individual training in military police operations. The assignment came as a surprise to many who had witnessed her early struggles, but Sarah had specifically requested the challenging field that would put her directly in harm's way alongside male soldiers. Advanced training brought a new set of challenges and a fresh group of skeptics. Unlike basic training, where everyone started as equals, Sarah now found herself surrounded by soldiers who had already proven themselves in various military specialties. Many of them had heard stories about the small female soldier who had somehow made it through basic, and they were curious to see if the stories were true. Staff Sergeant Michael Torres ran the military police training program with an iron fist and zero tolerance for weakness. A veteran of multiple combat deployments, he had seen too many soldiers fail when the pressure got real. During the first week, he made it clear that he would not lower standards for anyone, regardless of size, gender, or background. Sarah appreciated his honesty, even though it meant she would face the same grueling expectations as soldiers twice her size. The training was immediately more intense than basic had been. Physical conditioning was combined with tactical scenarios, weapons training, and high-stress decision-making exercises. Sarah found herself struggling again, but this time she had the mental tools to push through the difficulties. The confidence she had built during basic training served as a foundation that allowed her to tackle each new challenge methodically. Her first major test came during defensive tactics training. Sarah was paired against Tony, a former college wrestler who stood 6 feet 3 inches tall and weighed 240 pounds. The exercise was designed to teach soldiers how to subdue suspects using minimum force, but it quickly became apparent that traditional techniques wouldn't work when Sarah faced opponents with such overwhelming size advantages. Instructor Sergeant Park watched as Sarah was repeatedly overpowered during the initial exercises. Rather than giving up or requesting a different partner, she asked to study the techniques more carefully and practice them repeatedly until she found modifications that worked for her size. She discovered that timing and precision could overcome raw strength, but only if executed perfectly. Over the following weeks, Sarah developed her own fighting style based on speed, leverage, and psychological tactics. She learned to use her opponent's expectations against them, allowing them to underestimate her before executing techniques that neutralized their size advantage. Tony, who had initially seen their matchups as easy victories, found himself on the ground more often than he cared to admit. The academic portion of the training proved to be another area where Sarah excelled. Military law, investigative procedures, and tactical planning played to her strengths as a careful, detail-oriented thinker. She consistently scored in the top 5% of her class on written examinations and practical applications. Her comprehensive understanding of procedures and regulations began to earn respect from instructors who valued intelligence as much as physical capability. During a complex training scenario involving a simulated riot control situation, Sarah demonstrated leadership abilities that surprised everyone, including herself. When the designated team leader became overwhelmed by the chaos, Sarah stepped forward with a clear plan that efficiently controlled the situation. Her calm demeanor under pressure and ability to think tactically impressed Staff Sergeant Torres, who noted her potential for leadership roles. The breakthrough moment came during Week 8 of the 12-week program. The class was participating in a full-scale training exercise that simulated a forward operating base under attack. Sarah was assigned to a team responsible for protecting a key supply route, working alongside soldiers she had trained with for months, but who still harbored doubts about her capabilities in a real crisis. The exercise was designed to test everything they had learned, with instructors playing the roles of various threats and challenges. Sarah's team faced multiple scenarios including vehicle inspections, crowd control, and response to simulated attacks. Throughout the day-long exercise, she consistently performed at the same level as her teammates, making quick decisions under pressure and executing tactical procedures flawlessly. When their team leader was wounded in a simulated attack, Sarah took command without hesitation. She coordinated with other units, managed resources, and maintained security protocols while under intense pressure from the exercise controllers. Her performance during the leadership portion of the exercise earned praise from every instructor observing the scenario. More importantly, her teammates finally began to see her as an equal partner rather than someone they needed to protect or compensate for. Tony, who had initially viewed Sarah as a training partner to go easy on, publicly acknowledged that she had become one of the most technically proficient soldiers in their class. The respect she had earned was no longer grudging or conditional. It was based on demonstrated competence under pressure. As the training program entered its final month, Sarah had established herself as one of the top performers in her class. She still faced the occasional comment about her size, but the voices of doubt had been largely silenced by consistent performance. The real test, however, was still ahead when she would join an active unit and face the challenges of actual military police operations in an uncertain world. Sarah's first deployment came 8 months after completing advanced training. She was assigned to the 503rd Military Police Battalion, stationed at a forward operating base in eastern Afghanistan, where her unit was responsible for convoy security and base protection. The assignment represented everything she had trained for, but it also meant facing combat conditions where lives depended on every soldier's ability to perform under extreme pressure. The base commander, Colonel Hayes, had specifically requested female military police officers for operations involving local women and children, where cultural sensitivities required a different approach than traditional male-dominated units could provide. Sarah was one of only 3 women assigned to the battalion, and the responsibility weighed heavily on her as she prepared for her first overseas deployment. Her new squad leader was Sergeant First Class James, a 12-year veteran who had served multiple tours in Iraq and Afghanistan. Had heard about Sarah's training performance, but reserved judgment until he could see how she handled actual field conditions. He assigned her to Team Alpha, working alongside soldiers who had already completed one deployment together and had developed the tight bonds that come from shared danger. The team included Specialist Robert, a communications expert from Seattle, Corporal Danny Wells, a vehicle mechanic from rural Mississippi, and Private First Class Santos, a recent graduate from the same training program Sarah had completed. The dynamic was immediately different from training, where everyone was learning together. These soldiers had real combat experience, and Sarah needed to prove she belonged among them. Her first patrol came 3 days after arriving at the base. The mission was a routine convoy escort through a valley that had seen minimal enemy activity, but made it clear that routine didn't exist in a combat zone. Sarah was assigned as the gunner in the second vehicle, responsible for scanning the countryside for threats while maintaining radio communication with other vehicles in the convoy. The weight of the machine gun and the responsibility of protecting her teammates felt enormous as they rolled through the dusty Afghan landscape. Sarah had trained for this moment hundreds of times, but the reality of potentially having to make life-or-death decisions in split seconds was overwhelming. Every shadow, every movement in the distance, every piece of debris on the road required instant analysis and appropriate response. Halfway through the patrol, the convoy received reports of possible improvised explosive devices in their planned route, made the decision to take an alternate path through more mountainous terrain, which meant longer exposure time and more challenging driving conditions. Sarah found herself scanning rocky outcroppings and cave openings where enemy fighters could potentially hide, knowing that her vigilance was critical to everyone's safety. The patrol completed successfully without incident, but Sarah's performance had been noted by every member of her team. She had maintained professional composure, followed all protocols precisely, and demonstrated the same level of awareness and competence as soldiers with months more experience. His brief nod of approval when they returned to base spoke volumes about his assessment of her capabilities. Over the following weeks, Sarah participated in increasingly complex operations. She conducted vehicle searches at checkpoints, assisted with investigating incidents on the base, and provided security during humanitarian supply distributions to local villages. Each mission brought new challenges that tested different aspects of her training, and she consistently performed at the level her teammates expected. The defining moment came during her 6th week at the base. Sarah's team was assigned to escort a medical convoy to a remote village where Army doctors were providing emergency care to civilians injured in a mining accident. The mission required traveling through contested territory where enemy contact was considered likely, and every soldier understood the risks involved. Sergeant had been feeling unwell that morning, but insisted on leading the patrol despite Sarah's suggestion that he remain at the base. His dedication to his team was admirable, but it proved to be a critical error in judgment. Halfway to the village, collapsed in the passenger seat of the lead vehicle, overcome by what appeared to be heat exhaustion and dehydration. The convoy immediately stopped while the medics in the group assessed condition. He was conscious but clearly in distress, and the team faced a difficult decision. They were in an exposed position on an open road, making them vulnerable to attack, but needed immediate medical attention. The closest medical facility was back at their base, 3 miles behind them through dangerous terrain. Corporal Wells suggested calling for helicopter evacuation, but the nearest medical helicopter was 45 minutes away. In this condition, that delay could prove fatal, especially if they came under attack while waiting. The team needed to make a decision quickly, and with incapacitated, leadership fell to the next senior member of the unit. Sarah looked at her teammates and saw the same uncertainty she felt. None of them had expected to face a leadership crisis during what was supposed to be a straightforward escort mission. The medical convoy they were protecting couldn't delay their mission, as civilians in the village were depending on immediate care. The team needed to split their resources between continuing the mission and getting to safety. Without hesitation, Sarah volunteered to carry back to the base while the rest of the team continued with the convoy escort. Wells immediately protested, pointing out that Sarah weighed barely more than half what did, and carrying him 3 miles through rough terrain seemed impossible. The team began discussing alternatives, but Sarah had already made up her mind. She knelt beside and explained her plan. Using techniques she had learned from Sergeant Williams during basic training, she could fashion a carrying system that would distribute his weight more efficiently. More importantly, she was the only team member who could be spared from the convoy escort without compromising the mission. Her teammates looked skeptical, but they also recognized that they had few good options in a deteriorating situation. Sarah quickly assessed condition and the tactical situation surrounding their stranded convoy. The 200-pound sergeant was conscious, but severely dehydrated and showing signs of heat stroke. His body temperature was dangerously elevated, and delay could result in permanent damage or death. The 3-mile journey back to base would normally take less than an hour on foot, but carrying would transform it into an endurance test that seemed impossible for someone of Sarah's size. Using her combat gear and equipment, Sarah constructed a makeshift carrying harness that would distribute his weight across her shoulders and torso rather than relying purely on arm strength. She had practiced similar techniques during advanced training, but never with a real person in a life-threatening situation. Protested weakly, insisting that she should wait for backup or evacuation, but Sarah knew that time was the enemy they couldn't defeat. Corporal Wells and the other team members watched in amazement as Sarah maneuvered the unconscious sergeant onto her back using a fireman's carry modified with additional support straps. His dead weight seemed to dwarf her small frame, but she stood steadily and took her first steps toward the base. The sight was so unlikely that Wells later admitted he expected her to collapse within the first 100 yards. The terrain between their position and the base was unforgiving desert punctuated by rocky hills and loose sand that made every step treacherous. Sarah had to navigate carefully to avoid losing her footing, which could result in serious injury to both herself and. The sun was approaching its peak intensity, and she knew that heat would become an increasingly dangerous factor as the journey progressed. After the first quarter mile, Sarah's legs began to burn with the strain of carrying weight. Her breathing became labored, and sweat poured down her face despite the relatively cool morning temperature. Drifted in and out of consciousness, occasionally mumbling instructions or trying to convince Sarah to put him down and call for helicopter evacuation. The psychological challenge proved as difficult as the physical demands. Every step required Sarah to overcome her mind's insistence that the task was impossible. She focused on reaching small landmarks, a distinctive rock formation, a curve in the path, a cluster of scrub bushes, rather than thinking about the miles that remained. The technique she had learned during basic training served her well as she broke the overwhelming challenge into manageable segments. Halfway through the journey, Sarah encountered her most serious obstacle when the path required climbing over a rocky ridge that rose nearly 50 feet above the surrounding desert floor. Under normal circumstances, the climb would have been moderately challenging but certainly manageable. Carrying's unconscious form made it seem like scaling Mount Everest. Sarah studied the rocky face for several minutes, identifying handholds and planning her route carefully. She knew she would have only one opportunity to make the climb successfully, as fatigue was beginning to affect her judgment and coordination. Had become dead weight, offering no assistance as she maneuvered him into position for the ascent. The climb took nearly 20 minutes as Sarah moved methodically from one handhold to the next, testing each step carefully before committing her full weight to the rocky surface. Twice, she nearly lost her grip when loose stones gave way beneath her boots, but she managed to recover and continue upward. Remained unconscious throughout the climb, his condition visibly deteriorating as precious time elapsed. At the top of the ridge, Sarah allowed herself a 2-minute rest while surveying the remaining distance to the base. She could see the perimeter fence and guard towers in the distance, but at least a mile of open ground remained between her position and safety. Her legs felt like rubber, her shoulders ached from weight, and her hands were raw from the rocky climb, but she knew stopping was not an option. The final portion of the journey tested Sarah's mental strength more than her physical capabilities. Her body had moved beyond normal fatigue into a state where each step required conscious effort and determination. His breathing had become shallow and irregular, and she knew that his life depended entirely on her ability to cover the remaining distance. Base personnel later reported seeing a small figure moving slowly across the desert, carrying what appeared to be another person. Initially, they assumed it was a training exercise or possibly civilians seeking assistance. Only when Sarah came within a few hundred yards of the perimeter did guards recognize the impossible sight of a soldier less than half size carrying the unconscious sergeant toward safety. Medical personnel were waiting when Sarah finally staggered through the base entrance. She had covered the 3 miles in just under 2 hours, an achievement that every expectation and assumption about her physical capabilities was immediately rushed to the medical facility where doctors confirmed that Sarah's quick action had likely saved his life. The story of Sarah's impossible carry spread throughout the base within hours and reached other military installations within days. Soldiers who had served multiple deployments without witnessing anything comparable struggled to comprehend how someone of Sarah's stature had accomplished what seemed physically impossible. The skeptics who had questioned her presence in combat roles found their arguments completely dismantled by undeniable heroism. Recovered fully within a week and sought out Sarah to personally thank her for saving his life. He later wrote a commendation letter that detailed not only her physical achievement, but also her tactical thinking and leadership under extreme pressure. The letter became part of Sarah's permanent record and contributed to her rapid promotion through the ranks. The mockery that had followed Sarah through basic training and advanced training was permanently silenced by her actions that day. Soldiers throughout the battalion began seeking her advice on physical conditioning and mental preparation, recognizing that her small stature concealed extraordinary strength of character and determination. She had proven beyond any doubt that courage and capability could not be measured by height or weight, but only by actions when everything was on the line. Sarah Martinez had always been smaller than her peers, standing barely 5 feet 2 inches tall and weighing only 115 pounds. When she walked through the gates of Fort Benning for basic training, the other recruits couldn't help but stare. Some snickered behind her back, while others openly questioned whether she had what it took to make it through the grueling weeks ahead. The drill sergeants were equally skeptical. Sergeant Johnson, a towering man with arms like tree trunks, looked down at Sarah during the first formation and shook his head. He had seen plenty of recruits come and go, and in his experience, the small ones usually washed out within the first 2 weeks. Sarah could feel his doubt radiating toward her like heat from a furnace. During the initial physical fitness test, Sarah struggled with the push-ups. While the male recruits pumped out 30 or 40 with ease, she managed only 12 before her arms gave out. The pull-up bar might as well have been mounted on the moon for all the good it did her. She couldn't complete a single one. The running portion went better, but she still finished in the bottom quarter of the group. That evening in the barracks, the whispers started in earnest. A linebacker-sized recruit from Texas made no effort to keep his voice down when he told his bunkmate that having Sarah in their unit was like carrying dead weight. He predicted she would quit before the week was out, and several other recruits nodded in agreement. Jennifer, another female recruit who stood 6 inches taller and outweighed Sarah by 40 pounds, tried to be encouraging but couldn't hide her own doubts. She suggested that maybe Sarah should consider a different branch of service, one that didn't require as much physical strength. The comment stung, even though it came from a place of concern rather than malice. The next few days brought a series of humiliating failures. During obstacle course training, Sarah couldn't scale the rope climb and had to be helped over the wall by 2 other recruits. In combat training, she could barely lift the heavy equipment packs that the others shouldered with ease. Each stumble and struggle was met with eye rolls, sighs, and barely concealed laughter from her fellow soldiers in training. Sergeant, who supervised the combat training exercises, pulled Sarah aside after a particularly difficult session. His weathered face showed a mixture of frustration and pity as he suggested she might want to consider requesting a transfer to a non-combat military occupation specialty. The conversation was meant to be helpful, but Sarah felt like she was being written off before she had truly been given a chance to prove herself. The breaking point came during a group exercise where recruits had to work in pairs to carry heavy sandbags across a muddy field. Sarah was paired with David, a soft-spoken recruit from California who had been one of the few not to openly mock her struggles. Despite his best efforts to compensate for her limited strength, they finished dead last, covered in mud and exhaustion. As they trudged back to the barracks, Sarah could hear behind them loudly wondering why the military was lowering its standards to accommodate people who clearly weren't cut out for the job. His words echoed the thoughts that Sarah had been fighting in her own mind for days. Maybe everyone was right. Maybe she didn't belong here. That night, lying on her narrow bunk while listening to the sounds of the barracks settling around her, Sarah seriously considered quitting. She had 3 more weeks of basic training ahead of her, and if the first week was any indication, each day would bring fresh humiliation and proof of her inadequacy. The easy thing to do would be to pack her bags in the morning and go home to her family's small apartment in Phoenix. But something deep inside her refused to accept defeat. Sarah had grown up watching her single mother work 3 jobs to keep food on the table and a roof over their heads. Giving up wasn't in her DNA, even when everything and everyone seemed to be telling her that she was fighting a losing battle. She made a silent promise to herself that night that she would find a way to prove the doubters wrong, no matter how impossible it seemed. The morning sun cast long shadows across the rocky terrain of the mountainous region where Sergeant Maria Santos had been stationed for the past 8 months. At 26 years old, she had already seen more combat than most soldiers twice her age. Her unit, Alpha Company, had been tasked with establishing a forward observation post in hostile territory, deep behind enemy lines where communication was spotty and backup was hours away. Maria wiped the sweat from her brow as she adjusted her radio equipment. The crackling static had been their only companion for days, with intermittent contact with base camp becoming increasingly unreliable. Her team of 40 soldiers had been monitoring enemy movements in the valley below, gathering intelligence on supply routes and potential targets for future operations. The landscape around their position was unforgiving. Jagged rocks jutted out from the mountainside, creating natural barriers that provided both cover and obstacles. The terrain was so treacherous that vehicles couldn't navigate the steep inclines, forcing the unit to rely on foot patrols and careful positioning. Every step required caution, as loose stones could trigger small avalanches that would reveal their location to enemy forces below. Maria had grown up in a small farming community where resilience wasn't just valued, it was necessary for survival. Her father had taught her to fix tractors and handle livestock, while her mother had shown her how to tend to injuries when the nearest doctor was miles away. These skills had served her well in the military, where resourcefulness often meant the difference between life and death. Her fellow soldiers respected her not just for her tactical knowledge, but for her unwavering calm under pressure. When Private Johnson had been struck by shrapnel during a mortar attack 3 weeks prior, Maria had worked for hours to stop the bleeding and stabilize him until medical evacuation could arrive. Her steady hands and clear thinking had saved his life, earning her the unofficial title of team medic alongside her duties as communications specialist. The observation post they had established was strategically positioned on a rocky outcrop that provided excellent visibility of the valley below. From their vantage point, they could monitor a crucial supply route used by enemy forces to transport weapons and personnel between 2 major strongholds. The intelligence they gathered would be vital for planning future operations and potentially cutting off enemy reinforcements. Maria checked her watch and noted the time in her logbook. The routine observations had become second nature, but she never allowed complacency to creep in. Every detail mattered, every movement in the valley below could be significant. She had developed an almost supernatural ability to spot patterns in enemy behavior, predicting their movements with uncanny accuracy. The radio crackled to life, breaking the morning silence. Base Command was requesting their daily status report. Maria keyed the microphone and delivered her standard briefing, reporting no significant enemy activity overnight and confirming their position remained secure. The signal was weak, requiring her to repeat several transmissions, but the essential information got through. As she concluded the radio check, Maria noticed something that made her pause. In the distance, she could see dust clouds rising from multiple locations along the valley floor. This wasn't the usual pattern of enemy movement they had been observing. The dust indicated heavy vehicles or large troop formations moving simultaneously from several directions. She grabbed her binoculars and began a systematic scan of the area. What she saw made her blood run cold. This wasn't a routine supply convoy or patrol. The enemy was mobilizing in force, with armored vehicles and what appeared to be several hundred soldiers converging on positions that would allow them to surround the mountain where her unit was stationed. Maria immediately began plotting coordinates and estimated troop strengths. Her training kicked in as she methodically documented everything she observed. The enemy force was larger than anything they had encountered in this sector, and their movement patterns suggested this was a planned operation rather than a random patrol. She tried raising base command on the radio, but the morning atmospheric conditions were interfering with transmission. The weak signal that had barely carried their routine check-in was now completely inadequate for transmitting the urgent intelligence she had gathered. Time was running out, and her 40 soldiers were about to face an enemy force that outnumbered them 10-1. The weight of responsibility settled heavily on Maria's shoulders as she realized their precarious situation. The enemy was moving into position to cut off all escape routes, turning their strategic observation post into a potential death trap. Without reliable communication to call for backup or air support, they would have to rely on their training, their weapons, and their determination to survive what was shaping up to be the fight of their lives. Maria's mind raced as she continued monitoring the enemy movements through her binoculars. The situation was deteriorating rapidly. What had started as a routine observation mission was transforming into a desperate fight for survival. She could see enemy soldiers taking positions along that would give them commanding views of the mountain approaches. She quickly gathered her squad leaders and briefed them on what she had observed. Lieutenant, the unit's second in command, studied the tactical map as Maria pointed out the enemy positions. Sergeant Wilson, a veteran with 3 combat tours under his belt, shook his head grimly as he realized the implications of their situation. The enemy had clearly been planning this operation for some time. Their movements were too coordinated, too precise to be improvised. Someone had provided them with detailed intelligence about the observation post's location and the surrounding terrain. Maria felt a chill as she considered the possibility that their position had been compromised for days or even weeks. Despite the dire circumstances, Maria maintained her professional demeanor as she outlined their defensive options. The rocky terrain that had provided concealment now became their fortress. Natural choke points and defensive positions could help even the odds, but only if they used them wisely. Every soldier would need to make their ammunition count. The radio continued producing nothing but static despite repeated attempts to establish contact with base command. Maria tried adjusting frequencies and power settings, but the mountainous terrain and enemy jamming equipment made communication impossible. They were completely cut off, with no way to request reinforcements or air support. As the morning progressed, the enemy forces continued to tighten their noose around the mountain. Maria could see soldiers moving through the valley below, taking positions that would prevent any escape routes. Heavy weapons teams were setting up mortars and machine guns at strategic locations, preparing to rain death down on the observation post. The first enemy probe came just after noon. A small squad of soldiers approached from the eastern slope, testing the defensive perimeter. Maria's soldiers held their fire until the enemy was well within range, then opened up with devastating effect. The brief firefight echoed across the valley, and Maria knew their position was now fully compromised. Enemy mortar rounds began falling around their position within minutes of the first exchange. The explosions sent shards of rock flying in all directions, creating deadly shrapnel that forced the defenders to take cover in whatever natural shelter they could find. Maria pressed herself against a boulder as debris rained down around her. Between mortar barrages, she could hear the distinctive sound of enemy vehicles moving closer. They were bringing up heavier weapons and more troops, preparing for a sustained assault. Maria realized that her 40 soldiers were about to face overwhelming odds with limited ammunition and no prospect of resupply or reinforcement. She moved carefully between defensive positions, checking on her soldiers and coordinating their defense. Private Martinez had taken shrapnel in his shoulder, but was still able to operate his weapon. Corporal was running low on ammunition for his machine gun. Every soldier was dealing with their own challenges, but morale remained surprisingly high. The enemy's next assault came from multiple directions simultaneously. Maria could see muzzle flashes from at least 3 different approach routes as enemy soldiers advanced under covering fire from their mortars. The sound of automatic weapons filled the air as her defenders engaged targets at maximum range. Maria grabbed her rifle and joined the fight, picking targets carefully and making every shot count. Her marksmanship training paid off as she dropped 2 enemy soldiers who had advanced too far ahead of their squad. The battle was intense but brief, with the enemy withdrawing after taking casualties they hadn't expected. During the lull that followed, Maria assessed their situation. They had successfully repelled 2 enemy probes, but at a cost. 3 of her soldiers had been wounded, and ammunition supplies were running dangerously low. The enemy was clearly probing for weaknesses and would undoubtedly return with a larger force for the next assault. As she moved through their defensive positions, checking on ammunition and treating wounded soldiers, Maria noticed something that made her heart sink. The enemy was moving heavy equipment into position on the surrounding. She could see the distinctive shapes of rifles and heavy mortars being emplaced at locations that would give them direct fire onto the observation post. The tactical situation was becoming hopeless. Her 40 soldiers were surrounded by a force at least 10 times their size, with heavy weapons positioned to destroy their defensive positions. Without air support or artillery, they would be systematically destroyed by the enemy's overwhelming firepower advantage. Maria tried the radio again, cycling through every frequency and adjusting the antenna position. The static remained constant, mocking her desperate attempts to establish contact with the outside world. Their sophisticated communication equipment had been reduced to an expensive piece of useless electronics by the combination of terrain and enemy jamming. As the afternoon sun beat down on their rocky fortress, Maria realized that conventional defensive tactics would only delay the inevitable. The enemy had time, numbers, and heavy weapons on their side. Her soldiers were brave and well-trained, but they couldn't perform miracles. Unless something changed dramatically, none of them would see another sunrise. The third enemy assault began at sunset, when the fading light would make accurate shooting more difficult for the defenders. Maria could see enemy soldiers moving like shadows through the rocks below, their advanced equipment and night vision giving them a significant advantage as darkness approached. This time, the enemy didn't waste time with probing attacks. Heavy mortar rounds began falling in a systematic pattern, walking across the defensive positions with deadly precision. Maria pressed herself against the rocks as explosions erupted all around her position. The concussive force of the blasts made her ears ring, and dust filled the air so thickly that visibility dropped to just a few meters. Between the mortar strikes, she could hear her soldiers returning fire at muzzle flashes in the darkness. The distinctive crack of rifle fire mixed with the deeper roar of machine guns as both sides engaged in a deadly exchange. Maria grabbed her weapon and joined the fight, firing at targets that appeared and disappeared in the smoky darkness. A massive explosion erupted just 20 meters from her position, much larger than the mortar rounds they had been enduring. Maria realized the enemy had brought up rifles and was beginning to systematically destroy their defensive positions. The rocky outcrop that had provided natural protection was being pulverized by high-explosive rounds. The ground shook beneath her feet as another rifle round struck nearby. Shards of rock flew through the air like deadly missiles, and Maria felt something strike her left leg with tremendous force. The impact sent her tumbling down a steep rocky slope, her rifle flying out of her hands as she rolled uncontrollably through loose stones and debris. When she finally came to rest against a large boulder, Maria attempted to stand and immediately knew something was terribly wrong. Excruciating pain shot through both legs as she tried to put weight on them. Looking down in the dim light, she could see that her left leg was bent at an unnatural angle, and her right leg was trapped beneath a heavy rock that had fallen during her tumble. She tried to move the rock, but it was far too heavy for her to shift in her weakened condition. Worse, every movement sent waves of agony through her shattered legs. Maria realized with growing horror that both legs were broken, leaving her completely immobilized at the bottom of the rocky slope, approximately 200 meters from the main defensive position where her soldiers continued fighting for their lives. The battle raged above her as enemy forces pressed their assault with renewed vigor. She could hear the distinctive sound of enemy soldiers advancing through the rocks, their voices growing closer as they moved to flank her unit's defensive positions. Without her coordination and the intelligence she had been gathering, her soldiers would be fighting blind against an enemy that knew the terrain better than they did. Maria's radio had been damaged in the fall, its antenna broken and case cracked. She tried to activate it anyway, desperate to maintain contact with her soldiers, but only static emerged from the damaged speaker. The communication equipment that had been her lifeline to the outside world was now as useless as her broken legs. Despite the overwhelming pain, Maria forced herself to think clearly about their tactical situation. From her new position at the bottom of the slope, she had a different perspective on the battlefield. She could see enemy movement patterns that weren't visible from the original observation post. More importantly, she could see the locations where enemy heavy weapons teams had positioned their equipment. The enemy had made a critical error in their deployment. Their heavy mortars and rifles were positioned in a cluster on a that would be vulnerable to air attack if she could somehow call in coordinates. The problem was getting those coordinates to someone who could act on them, and doing it before her soldiers were overrun by the advancing enemy forces. Maria began dragging herself across the rocky ground, using her arms to pull her body forward while her useless legs trailed behind. Every meter was agony, as sharp stones cut into her uniform and loose rocks shifted under her weight. The 200 meters between her position and the communications equipment at the observation post might as well have been 200 kilometers given her condition. Progress was agonizingly slow. The rocky terrain that had provided defensive advantages now became a series of obstacles that threatened to stop her advance entirely. Steep sections required her to find handholds and pull herself up using arm strength alone. Loose scree shifted under her weight, threatening to send her sliding back down the slope she had worked so hard to climb. The sounds of battle continued above her, but Maria noticed a change in the intensity of fire from her unit's positions. The volume of defensive fire was decreasing, which meant either her soldiers were running out of ammunition or they were taking casualties that reduced their ability to maintain effective resistance. Either scenario meant time was running out. Halfway up the slope, Maria paused to rest and assess her progress. Her arms were trembling from exhaustion, and blood from numerous cuts was making her grip on the rocks increasingly precarious. The pain from her broken legs was becoming harder to ignore, threatening to overwhelm her ability to think clearly about the tactical situation. She could see enemy soldiers moving through positions that had been defended by her troops just an hour earlier. The perimeter was shrinking as her outnumbered soldiers fell back to more defensible positions. Without reinforcements or air support, they would eventually be overrun regardless of their courage and training. Maria forced herself to continue climbing, driven by the knowledge that 40 lives depended on her ability to reach the communications equipment and call in the coordinates for an airstrike. The enemy heavy weapons positions she had identified represented the best chance of evening the odds and giving her soldiers a fighting chance to survive until reinforcements could arrive. Maria's hands were raw and bleeding as she continued her desperate crawl up the rocky slope. Each handhold was becoming more difficult to maintain as exhaustion weakened her grip and blood made the stones slippery. The sounds of battle above had changed again, with longer pauses between exchanges of gunfire that suggested her soldiers were being pushed back to their final defensive positions. The pain from her broken legs had evolved from sharp, stabbing sensations to a constant, overwhelming agony that threatened to cloud her judgment. Maria found herself having to stop every few meters to fight off waves of nausea and dizziness. Her body was going into shock from the trauma and blood loss, making each meter of progress more difficult than the last. As she pulled herself over a particularly challenging section of rocky terrain, Maria could see the glow of fires burning at the observation post above. The enemy's heavy weapons had found their mark, destroying equipment and supplies that her unit desperately needed. The acrid smell of burning fuel and electronics drifted down the slope, carrying with it the bitter reality of their deteriorating situation. She paused to listen carefully to the sounds of combat above. The defensive fire from her unit had become sporadic, with long gaps between shots that indicated either severe ammunition shortages or casualties among her soldiers. Maria could also hear enemy voices much closer than before, suggesting that hostile forces had penetrated the outer defensive perimeter. Forcing herself to continue despite the overwhelming fatigue, Maria dragged her body across loose scree that shifted dangerously under her weight. Several times, she nearly lost her grip and slid backward, erasing precious progress that had taken tremendous effort to achieve. The 200 meters that had seemed manageable in theory was proving to be an almost impossible distance given her condition. Her military training kept her focused on the mission despite the physical trauma she was enduring. Maria had been taught to compartmentalize pain and fear, to maintain operational effectiveness even under the most extreme circumstances. Those lessons were being tested to their absolute limits as she fought her way up the mountainside with 2 broken legs. The backup radio at the observation post represented her soldiers' only chance for survival. If she could reach it and successfully transmit the coordinates for the enemy heavy weapons positions, Air support could destroy the mortars and rifles that were systematically eliminating her unit's defensive positions. Without that fire support, the overwhelming enemy numbers would eventually succeed in overrunning the observation post. Maria's progress had slowed to just a few meters every 10 minutes. Her arms were cramping from the constant strain, and dehydration was making her increasingly lightheaded. The adrenaline that had initially masked some of the pain was wearing off, leaving her to deal with the full intensity of her injuries while maintaining the mental focus necessary to navigate the treacherous terrain. She could see muzzle flashes from enemy weapons that had taken positions on the same where her soldiers had established their observation post just that morning. The tactical situation had completely reversed, with her outnumbered unit now defending against attacks from positions that offered commanding views of their remaining strongholds. A massive explosion erupted near the top of the slope, much closer than any of the previous impacts. The concussive wave rolled over Maria's position, showering her with loose rocks and debris. When the dust cleared, she realized that the enemy had successfully targeted the main communications bunker, destroying the primary radio equipment that had been her original objective. For a moment, despair threatened to overwhelm her determination. If the main radio was destroyed, her desperate climb would be meaningless. But Maria forced herself to remember the backup communication protocols they had established. There was a secondary radio position that might still be operational, though reaching it would require her to traverse even more difficult terrain. The secondary position was located in a natural cave formation about 50 meters beyond the main observation post. It had been established as an emergency communication site in case the primary position was compromised. Maria had personally supervised the installation of the backup equipment, ensuring that it was properly concealed and protected from enemy fire. As she continued her agonizing ascent, Maria could see that several of her defensive positions had gone silent. The absence of return fire from those locations meant that her soldiers had either been killed, wounded, or forced to abandon their positions. The enemy was systematically reducing their defensive capabilities while positioning for a final assault. She pulled herself over another rocky outcrop and suddenly found herself much closer to the fighting than she had expected. Enemy soldiers were moving through positions that her troops had held just hours earlier. Maria forced herself to remain motionless as hostile forces passed within meters of her position, their attention focused on the remaining defensive strongholds ahead. The proximity of enemy soldiers made her realize how precarious her situation had become. If discovered, she would be captured or killed before she could complete her mission. Maria had to balance the need for speed against the necessity of remaining undetected as enemy patrols moved through the area she was trying to traverse. Her broken legs continued to trail uselessly behind her. She dragged herself forward, using only her arms for propulsion. The rocky ground had shredded her uniform and lacerated her skin, leaving a trail of blood that she hoped would not be noticed by passing enemy soldiers. Every movement required tremendous willpower to overcome the pain and exhaustion that threatened to end her mission before she could reach the backup radio. Maria could barely maintain consciousness as she approached the final 50 meters to the backup radio position. Her vision was beginning to blur from blood loss and exhaustion, and her arms trembled uncontrollably from the sustained effort of dragging her body up the rocky mountainside. The sounds of battle had intensified above her, suggesting that the enemy was launching their final assault on her unit's remaining defensive positions. She forced herself to focus on the coordinates she had memorized for the enemy heavy weapons positions. The numbers had to be exact if the airstrike was going to be effective. Any error in the targeting data would result in wasted ordnance, while her soldiers continued to face impossible odds. Maria repeated the coordinates silently as she crawled, using the mental exercise to maintain focus despite her deteriorating physical condition. The cave entrance that housed the backup communication equipment was finally visible ahead, partially concealed behind a cluster of boulders that provided natural camouflage. Maria had never been so grateful to see anything in her entire life. The backup radio represented not just her unit's salvation, but validation that her agonizing 200-meter crawl had not been in vain. As she approached the cave entrance, Maria could hear enemy soldiers moving through the area above her position. Their voices carried clearly in the thin mountain air, and she realized they were conducting a systematic search of the observation post's defensive positions. Time was running out faster than she had anticipated, and the backup radio might be discovered before she could transmit the crucial targeting information. She pulled herself into the cave entrance and immediately located the backup radio equipment. The secondary communication system had survived the enemy bombardment intact, its antenna properly positioned and power indicators showing green. Maria had never seen a more beautiful sight than those glowing status lights indicating operational readiness. Her hands shook as she powered up the radio and began cycling through frequencies to establish contact with base command. The backup system had more power than the portable radios they had been using, and Maria hoped the increased signal strength would penetrate the atmospheric interference and enemy jamming that had prevented earlier communication attempts. Static filled her headset as she transmitted her call sign and emergency status. For terrifying seconds, only the crackling of atmospheric interference answered her desperate calls. Then, like a miracle, a clear voice responded from base command, acknowledging her transmission and requesting immediate status report. Maria's training took over as she delivered the critical information with professional precision despite her physical condition. She transmitted the coordinates for the enemy heavy weapons positions, identified the types of equipment she had observed, and provided detailed information about the tactical situation facing her surrounded unit. The voice from base command confirmed receipt of her targeting data and informed her that air support was already airborne and en route to her location. Fighter aircraft armed with precision-guided munitions would arrive within 15 minutes to engage the enemy positions she had identified. Maria felt a surge of hope as she realized her desperate mission was succeeding. She maintained radio contact to provide real-time updates on enemy movements and to help coordinate the incoming airstrike. From her position in the cave, Maria could observe the battlefield and relay information about target priorities and friendly force locations. Her role had evolved from wounded survivor to forward air controller, directing the precision strikes that would determine the battle's outcome. The distinctive sound of approaching jet aircraft filled the valley as the air support arrived exactly on schedule. Maria watched through her binoculars as the fighter planes lined up for their attack runs on the enemy heavy weapons positions she had identified. The coordinates she had crawled 200 meters to transmit were about to be transformed into decisive military action. The first precision-guided bomb struck the enemy mortar position with devastating accuracy. The explosion sent a column of smoke and debris high into the air, eliminating the heavy weapons that had been systematically destroying her unit's defensive positions. Secondary explosions indicated that the strike had also destroyed ammunition stockpiles stored near the enemy equipment. Additional air strikes followed in rapid succession, targeting each of the enemy heavy weapons positions Maria had identified during her desperate crawl up the mountainside. The rifles and heavy mortars that had given the enemy their overwhelming firepower advantage were systematically destroyed by the precision ordnance. With their heavy weapons eliminated, the enemy force found itself in an untenable position. The overwhelming numerical advantage that had seemed decisive just minutes earlier was neutralized without the supporting fire that had enabled their assault. Maria could see enemy soldiers withdrawing from exposed positions as the tactical balance shifted dramatically in favor of her defenders. Her soldiers, sensing the change in momentum, launched a counterattack that drove the demoralized enemy forces back down the mountainside. The observation post that had seemed doomed to fall was suddenly secure again, with enemy forces retreating in disorder after losing their heavy equipment and suffering significant casualties. Maria remained at the backup radio position, coordinating with base command and providing updates on enemy withdrawal routes. Additional air support arrived to pursue the retreating forces, ensuring that they could not regroup for another assault. The battle that had seemed hopeless just an hour earlier had been transformed into a decisive victory. Medical evacuation helicopters arrived shortly after the airstrikes concluded, guided to the observation post by the same radio equipment Maria had used to coordinate the life-saving air support. As medics loaded her onto a stretcher for transport to the field hospital, she could see her 40 soldiers securing the perimeter and accounting for their casualties. The final tally revealed that Maria's desperate 200-meter crawl with 2 broken legs had indeed saved 40 lives. Her unit had suffered casualties during the intense fighting, but the timely air support she had called in prevented the complete destruction that had seemed inevitable. The enemy heavy weapons positions she had identified and targeted were completely destroyed, eliminating the threat they had posed to future operations in the region.